Hey everybody, and welcome to Politics, Culture and Some Other Shit. I'm going to do a little reaction to the Michelle O'Neill article, or her comments recently, where she says that there was no alternative to IRA violence. Now, I haven't read the comments. I've deliberately held off, so I don't know what she said. I have an idea. I sort of got the headline, seen a few tweets and stuff. So I'm going to read them now for the first time, and I'm going to, explain things. So the article I've got here is, I'll just put it up on screen there. It's from Irish Central. It's an American publication, I believe. You can get pretty much the same thing on the Daily Telegraph or the Guardian. In fact, there's a couple, I have them up there, but I'm going to read from this one. And then underneath, you can see down at the bottom here, there's the various reactions from the other leaders of the various political parties here in the north of Ireland. So we'll do this and see if we can give a little bit of context and just explore a little bit about what she said, because it has the usual. We'll read it first and then we'll talk about it afterwards. And I have a little Twitter thread that gives more context. So you should know before we start this that I am an Irish nationalist. So my sympathies certainly lie one way, not with IRA violence, but we'll talk about that afterwards. So let's do this. So Sinn Féin VP criticised for saying there was no alternative to IRA violence. Michelle O'Neill says there was no alternative to IRA violence during the Troubles, but says now the Good Friday Agreement provides an alternative to conflict. Well, yes, so good so far. By Kerry O'Shea. And she can be found on Twitter at Kerry_O'Shea. And this is from August 4th, 2022. So let's do this. Michelle O'Neill, the Vice President of Sinn Féin and the First Minister designate of Northern Ireland, is facing criticism after she shared her views about the Irish Republican Army during the Troubles. O'Neill, whose father, Brenton Doris, was a provisional IRA prisoner and a Sinn Féin councillor, and whose two cousins were in the IRA, made the comments during a nearly half-hour interview with Mark Carruthers for the Red Lines podcast. So the full podcast is available. The full 30-minute interview is available on the Red Lines podcast, which is Mark Carruthers. He's a BBC journalist, so you can check that out if you want. Carruthers, who noted that O'Neill has been outspoken against violence, asked if she felt it was right at the time for members of your family and others to engage in violent resistance to British rule here. She replied, this is the controversial bit. I think at the time there was no alternative, but now thankfully we have an alternative to conflict, and that is the Good Friday Agreement, and that's why it's so precious to us all. So she replied, I think at the time there was no alternative, but now thankfully we have an alternative to conflict, and that is the Good Friday Agreement, and that's why it's so precious to us all. Okay. Right. So break that statement down into two component parts. The first part, I think at the time there was no alternative. Agree, disagree, right? And then the second part, but now thankfully we have an alternative to conflict, and that is the Good Friday Agreement, which is why it is so precious. Now, that's very important. So I'm going to see if I can just highlight that. Copy that. Okay. So, onwards. We'll come back to this. That's the important part. O'Neill said that she has been in active politics. She's been active in politics in a full-time manner since 1998, the year the Good Friday Agreement was signed. My whole adult life has been about building the peace process, she said. I wish the conditions were never here that actually led to conflict. I wish that so many people didn't have the horrible experience that they've had throughout the conflict days. And that's everyone's experience. I think the only way we're ever going to build a better future is actually to understand that it's okay to have a different take on the past. Fair enough, I agree with that. My narrative is very different is a very different one to someone who's perhaps lost a loved one at the hands of Republicans. Absolutely, of course, that's obviously true. I think that we need to be mature enough to be able to say, well, that's okay. We'll have to agree to differ on that one, but let's make sure that the conditions never exist again, that we find ourselves in that scenario. I agree. I completely agree with that sentiment. We must understand that the Good Friday Agreement, and I agree with her holding up the Good Friday Agreement in such importance. I agree with that completely. My life, I've said it many times in this podcast, my life wouldn't be the way it is only for the Good Friday Agreement. It changed my life. I remember there was a before. In fact, I was talking to two young people actually about it yesterday. Believe it or not, we were a young footballer, a guy originally from Angola, moved to Portugal and now moved to Ireland, a young 26-year-old footballer, and a young girl of 17 years of age, a local Irish girl. And I brought the Good Friday Agreement up when we were talking, and they kind of didn't get it. They didn't understand it. They did not politically engage people, but they were. You could see them going, really? Was that important? Yes. So, she says here that we need to be mature enough to be able to agree to disagree. I'm sorry, that's my point. The Good Friday Agreement, the beautiful thing about the Good Friday Agreement was it didn't ask what we couldn't live with. That its starting point. It didn't ask what we could live with. It didn't ask what we couldn't live with. It asked what we could live with. What is it you can agree to? Let's go from there. Let's start from there. And that was where the Good Friday. So we know what we don't want. We know what you don't want. We know what you don't want. But what can you agree to? And this was why so the border was lifted. So Irish people from the north were able to travel freely up and down through Ireland, and to all intents and purposes pretend that we were living in a united Ireland. So that was that. And there was concessions made in union and the IRA decommissioned and all this sort of stuff, and everybody got something, and everybody sort of gave something, and that was why it worked, and that's why it's still working. But now it's under attack because of this Northern Ireland Protocol thing, which is obviously what the context for this interview was taking place. I haven't listened to the podcast. I will listen to it. But this is just my reaction to her comments. But we're going to get back to the blue highlighty bit up here. We'll get back to that in a sec. So onwards with the article. So this is why we have to guard the peace process, and we have to nurture the peace process, and we have to continually look to the future and find ways that allow us to be more comfortable with understanding everyone's different perspective of the past, and be very firm and confident about looking to the future for something better for us all. And there is the podcast, the BBC Red Lines podcast. So you can check that out. Since the podcast, O'Neill has faced some criticism for her notion that there was no alternative to violence. I'm not surprised at what she said, but it is very sickening. Colin Wharton, whose brother Kenneth Wharton was amongst the 10 Protestants killed by the IRA near Kingsmill, County Armagh in 1976, said on BBC Radio Ulster on Wednesday, there was always an alternative, but the choice was always there. Murder or not to murder, bomb or not to bomb. That choice was always there. Politicians in Northern Ireland have also criticised O'Neill's comments. Naomi Long, head of the Alliance Party: we have all our own perspectives, but we aren't entitled to our own truth. She added, Thousands of people, including the majority of nationalists who did not pursue violence to achieve their political aims, are testament to that. Indeed, one could argue the use of violence delayed the reaching of political accommodation until 1998. Its devastating impacts are still felt personally and politically to this day. So there's Naomi Long, leader of Alliance, who's cutting the tripe out of unionism at the moment. Colm Eastwood, head of the SDLP. There was an alternative to IRA violence. John Hume led that alternative, and the nationalists people backed it. The IRA murdered thousands of its own people, destroyed businesses, ruined young people's lives by selling them a twisted ideology, and put the cause of Irish unity back decades. Okay. Again, I'm going to get to a Twitter thread that puts a bit more meat on the bones. A DUP, yeah, who cares? A First Minister for everyone does not justify murder. Oh dear, it's not what I wanted to do. There we go. A First Minister for everyone does not justify murder. Michelle O'Neill's comments do not fit with support for the rule of law. Murder is never justified. I don't think she did justify murder. First Minister, everyone cannot justify murder. Don't know. Doug Beattie, head of the Ulster Unionist Party, said the alternative to violence is dialogue and democracy. Well, that's all good and well coming from a fucking British soldier. Fair enough. Who, again, going to put some meat on the bones here. A representative of the British Crown who fucking cut and murdered their way through the population of this island. How far do you want to go back? But we're talking about the north here. So for 100 years, is no position to talk about violence. And Jeffrey Donaldson's the same. I think he used to be. Was he in the UDR? Who are just a rebadged black and tan. So yeah, it is there's a bit of hypocrisy going on here. John Hume, Seamus Mallon, Joe Hendren understood that alternative path existed in the 70s, but it wasn't enough for the IRA godfathers. Michelle O'Neill is entitled to her opinion, not entitled to her alternative facts. Well, I could throw that back at you, Doug. There were always alternatives to IRA murder. Of course there was. But again, stay with me. And this is not, I sound like I'm an apologist for Michelle O'Neill's, or I'm backing Michelle O'Neill's comments up. I have my own issues with what Michelle O'Neill said. Well, I don't really, there's not a lot there I really can disagree with, but I'm going to put a bit of context on her comments for you, because quite often the political response, in order to generate the headline, is context free. And depending on the constituency that you're talking to, that's all you need. You don't need any meat on those bones. But I'm going to put some on for you. So finally, Jim Allister, head of the TUV, Traditional Unionist Voice, said O'Neill's comments are a timely reminder to the DUP of why they should not enthrone her as First Minister. Obsessed with royalty, these fuckers. Enthrone. She was elected. Unlike the Queen. The brazen endorsement, Jim, you can just see it in his wee Elmer Fudd voice. The brazen endorsement of IRS sectarian murder through Michelle O'Neill's infamous no alternative comment is a timely reminder of the DUP of why they should not enthrone her as First Minister. Words of condemnation are good, but actions of condemnation are better. Yeah. Jim. So there we go. So back to the so there's the comments there. There's the. Let's see if I can zoom in on that actually. I've got one of these Apple Magic Mouses and I don't know how it works. You're supposed to be able to zoom in on the thing. Anyway. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. See if I can get on screen. There we go. Yeah. So her. Let me see. There we go. Just waiting that out and close that off. Sorry, I'm just fucking about on the screen here. So there it is. She replied, I think at the time there was no alternative. But now, thankfully, we have an alternative to conflict, and that is the Good Friday Agreement, and that's why it's so precious to us all. So, again, break it down. I think there was no alternative to violence at the time. So let's do this. At the time? What time? What are we talking about? So here we go. Let's get to it. Here's a thread. Here's a Twitter thread for you. So this is a guy, Shea Murphy, Seneca is his name on Twitter. And it's a thread. So here we go. I'm going to read this out for you. There's been a huge amount of historical revisionism going on the past few days based on comments by Michelle O'Neill, stripped of context and taken as some kind of freeze frame, using hindsight to lay the blame at a particular door. Absolutely true. So, first of all, I do think the comments could have been better framed. I think it would have been better to say some or many. Many people felt they had no other choice. They were moved by evolving events. The peaceful civil rights movement was met with extreme violence and prejudice, with the full force of the state behind them. This was in context of 50 years of discrimination and oppression, and the fact that Catholics and nationalists were second-class citizens. The place was at boiling point. The people in power were not for negotiating, quite the opposite. Now, that is definitely a better way of putting it. But not that Michelle O'Neill's comments weren't. They were more concise, let's say that. But onwards. So, onwards with Seneca's Twitter thread. Those people in power helped create the atmosphere in which violence flourished. I was lucky enough not to grow up in Ardoyne, Ballymurphy, Short Strand, the Bogside, and many other places where people felt under siege. My life could have turned out differently. The idea that violence happened in isolation is for the birds. Discrimination and indeed hatred towards the Catholic population was visceral and real, and to a significant extent continues to this day. Events like Ballymurphy, the rape of the Falls and Bloody Sunday made lots of young men and women who would not otherwise have been involved in violence believed that violence was the answer. People were being murdered and under attack. So that's the time that we're talking about. So I think at the time there was no alternative. This was the time. This is what was happening at the time. Right? Lots of young men. So people were being murdered and under attack. The fact cannot be extrapolated into some little revisionist historical soundbite. Study conflicts across the world from apartheid, Sharpeville, onwards, the Palestinian Intifada, etc. When people are backed into a corner, physically, not imaginary, then the conditions for violence is ripe. At one point, even Jerry Lord Fitt was demanding guns. So, who's that? So we're talking about the previous leader to the SDLP. So we know John Hume was a great man, and I'm not having a dig. God forbid I should have a pop at John Hume because he's one of my heroes for what he just for the Good Friday Agreement alone. Colm Eastwood, the current leader of the SDLP, there wasn't he criticises here. He's criticising Michelle O'Neill's comments here, as you can see. Right? And again, put a context to this. It's not that he's wrong in what he's saying. To your point, John Hume led that alternative and the nationalist people backed it. That's true. The IRA murdered thousands of its own people. That sadly is true as well. Destroyed businesses and ruined young people's lives by selling them a twisted ideology. So he's not lying but there's no context. And as Seneca says here, the fact cannot be extrapolated into some little revisionist historical soundbite. Jerry Fitt, the original leader of the SDLP, was at one point demanding guns for the Irish nationalist population, the Irish Catholics in the north of Ireland. That's how bad it got, that these men of peace were demanding guns. They were for news conferences and trying to gather up money to buy guns to defend the people in the north. That's how bad it got. So whenever Michelle O'Neill says this, there was, I think at the time, there was no alternative. Do you understand? Do you get the point? Taken out of context, taken as Seneca put it, the fact cannot be extrapolated into some little revisionist historical soundbite, and that's what's happened. That's exactly what's happened here. Okay, so onwards. What then happens is a cherry picking of various atrocities that somehow should never be seen in isolation rather than the context in which they really happened. Everything has cause and effect, however tragic. I would question any serious historian. I would question any serious historian to question my assertion that the IRA were a symptom and not a cause, and that's my position. That's exactly my position. They were a symptom, not a cause. They didn't come first. There was something else happened to cause. That's not to justify what they did. Right? That's not to justify what they did. But we need to be adult about this. We need to grow. We need to be serious about this. You can't turn around and say, I condemn the IRA violence, but don't. That's where your thought process stops. You don't move beyond. You say, I condemn IRA violence. You say, but you understand what the IRA were. Doesn't matter, don't care. But you need to know why the IRA happened. Why they were born, why they were brought into life. Don't care, don't need to know. Don't want it. I just condemn the violence, that's it. What about state violence? I condemn IRA violence. What about the RUC, the UDR, it's the state MI5, all the black forces that went underseen, the collusion between the loyalists and the British Secret Services that we spoke about with Paddy Fox a few months ago on this very podcast. I'll never forget the fact, one of the things he told me, that the road that he lives on, every house on it, and a rural country road in County Tyrone, every house on it has had someone in it murdered by a loyalist terrorist. And then he goes and joins the IRA. Of course he did. What the fuck did you think he was going to do? If that happened to you, you would do the same. And by the way, even Paddy Fox, who's an unrepentant ex-provisional IRA volunteer, doesn't clean. He didn't say that the IRA got it right. He said there was things that they did that I can't stand over. Everybody says the same thing. He said, but that, I would say Paddy would probably excuse a lot more than I would. But nonetheless, you need to understand and give everything context, put meat on that bone. Why did the IRA happen? It happened because of what Seneca is explaining in this Twitter thread. And that's why the outrage, I feel, towards Michelle O'Neill's comments are faux. They're for political expediency. The IRA, or her comments about the IRA are an easy target on Sinn Féin. So to awkward metaphor there, but because they are the top of the political tree right now, all across this island. So anything that she says, but then Seneca has, anything she says is going to be taken apart, especially whenever it's something as controversial still as the IRA. So, back to Seneca's thread here, which is brilliant, I think. Yeah. I would question any serious historian to question my assertion that the IRA were a symptom, not the cause. There were, of course, other actors on the stage accelerating sectarian violence, playing war games, and using inflammatory colonial counterinsurgency techniques. Right? This is what we're talking about here. They colluded with other armed actors, providing information, collusion, and outright involvement in killings. Nobody has the right to the moral high ground. The idea that IRA violence happened in a vacuum is historically and factually rubbish. Of course, there are a lot of people who want to make a lot of political capital out of this. Exactly my point. Particularly on the right wing in the Republic. Yeah, oh, that's good. That'll come up on the screen. Who achieved their independence by what means? The war is over. Remembrance should not be used to score cheap political points. Thousands died who shouldn't have died, but that blame is shared. There is something very cynical about this faux outrage. Don't be fooled, especially by today's warmongers. Lots of them have no problem with bombing and killing people in other places. As he puts it very well. Indeed. So, yeah, I actually commented under this about... Oh, no, Tai Hickey. No, that's it. Yeah, so that's that. We're done. That's the thread. So... So does that help? Does that help? Yeah. So the IRA didn't happen in a vacuum. There was reasons for them to exist, and I would urge you to go back and listen to one of my podcasts with Paddy Fox. It's available everywhere. It's on YouTube. It's on your podcast app. As to why the IRA or what people like him felt, what they were facing, what they felt they had to do to counter it. So I'm not excusing the IRA. I'm not excusing the IRA violence. I remember very well. I grew up here too, in Lurgan, North Armagh, North Lurgan, and I remember very well IRA violence. I know people who were murdered by the IRA who didn't do anything wrong, and I'm not excusing it. I'm not celebrating it. I'm not revising it historically. I'm just saying I condemn it out utterly. All I'm saying is the comments that Michelle O'Neill has made are being used to score cheap political points, and there is a faux outrage. Again, her comment, I think at the time there was no alternative. We're talking at a time when peaceful civil rights marches were being attacked, not just by the British security state forces, the RUC and whatever, and the secret armies, but there was just average Protestants were attacking these marchers, trying to demand civil rights. See, exactly the same civil rights that our black brothers and sisters were demanding in America. The right to vote, the right to housing, the right to equal jobs and pay and all the normal things that we consider to be baseline in a civilized society. That's why they're called civil rights. But those marches were attacked and people were killed on them. You know, you go through the Ballymurphy massacre, the Bloody Sunday in Derry. These things were all, you know, Ballymurphy wasn't even a march. It was just a massacre. It was a civil rights march in Derry in 72. So you can't turn around and do that and then act surprised whenever the people's response, not everybody's response, but some of the people's response was to fight back. What the fuck did you think was going to happen? And listen, if we end up in a united Ireland, God willing, and we end up with a border poll and that happens, you know, this is one of the fears. One of the fears of the loyalists, the unionists, is that we're going to treat them as badly as they had treated us. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, and if it does, I'll be on their side, demanding rights for them. But it won't happen. Those days are gone, I believe. So, yeah. So there we go. That's it. that's the thing. I wanted to come and talk to you about that. I hope it puts, hope it works. Yeah, gives you a bit of context. Yeah, that's it all. Yeah, so listen, don't be afraid to like this, share, subscribe. If you want to, head over to my Patreon. The link will be under the video, and you can lend me your support, £3 a month, that's all it is. And you get all these extra bits and pieces. Okay, take care. Have a good Sunday. Bye.